still remember the sound of the paper tearing, soft and careless, like it meant nothing. And for a moment, I just stood there watching my granddaughter fold the check I had written with a shaking hand, the $1 million gift I thought would help her future, and she held it between her fingers as if it were trash from the street, calling it just a paper scrap. And the room went quiet in a way that pressed against my chest, because I had seen disappointment in my life, but never from my own blood, never from a girl I once carried on my shoulder while her mother slept. My name is Janet, and before I go deeper, let me say this: share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon, because this moment changed the course of our family, and I need you to follow every step with me as I stood there holding my mask of calm, while inside something trembled, something old and tired, and I wondered how a child raised with love could look at a blessing that large and see only something to mock. But before I could speak, she laughed, not loudly, just enough to cut through me. And then she asked a question I never expected from her, one that made me realize the problem was far bigger than disrespect, and that someone had been whispering things to her long before she walked into my room today. And it was the person she trusted most. She stood near my window with the check still in her hand, the afternoon light touching her face in a way that reminded me of when she was small and used to follow me around the garden, asking why flowers listened better than people. But now her eyes carried something sharper, something learned, and when I asked her why she called it a scrap, she didn't look at me. Instead, she looked at the door, as if waiting for someone to appear and confirm her courage. And that alone told me this moment wasn't born from her heart. It was borrowed from another voice, a voice that had been shaping her thoughts when I wasn't near. And she finally said, "Grandma, money doesn't impress me," in a tone too steady for her age, too polished, almost rehearsed. And I felt the weight of those words settle on my chest, because I never raised her mother to teach a child to talk this way. Yet here she was, standing before me with an attitude that didn't belong to her spirit. And I walked closer, keeping my mask steady, calm. The same mask that helped me survive the years when people judged me for being poor, for being quiet, for marrying a man they believed was too powerful for a woman like me. And I told her the check wasn't meant to impress her. It was meant to support her. But she cut me off with a small smile, the type that doesn't belong on a young girl's face. And she whispered, "Mom said you always try to buy love." And that sentence pushed the air out of my lungs, not because of the accusation, but because it was said so gently. She believed it with her whole heart, and I knew then that this wasn't just disrespect. This was a seed planted, watered, and protected by someone close to me, someone who had forgotten every hand I offered, every sacrifice made quietly, every door I opened for their comfort. And when I asked her what exactly her mother had told her, she hesitated, looked away, and the fear in her eyes told me the truth was far heavier than the sentence she had just spoken. And she was terrified I would discover who else was involved. She kept twisting that check between her fingers, rolling the edge tighter each time. And I could see her pulse in her wrist, quick and uneven, as if the words she carried were too heavy for her young heart. And I softened my voice, telling her she didn't need to fear me. But fear wasn't the real thing in her eyes. It was conflict, the kind a child feels when loyalty is being pulled from two different directions. And she finally whispered that her mother said I used money to control everyone, a sentence that sat wrong even as she spoke it, because this girl had watched me give without asking anything back, had watched me show up at every recital, every birthday, every time her parents were too busy fighting over business deals to notice her. And I stepped a little closer, slowly, as if approaching a wounded bird, and asked her if she believed what she just said. She swallowed hard, looked down, and the check slipped from her hand to the floor, landing quietly. But the sound felt loud to me, louder than any argument I'd had with her mother in the past years, because now the fight was moving through generations, and I could feel the cracks traveling through the room like cold air under a door. And she told me she didn't know what to believe anymore, that her mother said I used money as a weapon, that everything I gave came with a hidden cost. And hearing that brought back memories. I kept buried memories of her mother, younger and frustrated, insisting she deserved more than the shares I handed her. More respect, more control, more influence, always more. Even when she hadn't earned the responsibilities she demanded. And I looked at my granddaughter standing there, caught in the middle of a story told by someone wounded, someone who forgot the truth, because bitterness tastes easier than gratitude. And I wanted to reach out and hold the child who once clung to my dress, but she stepped back, just a small half step, enough to tell me someone had told her to keep emotional distance from me. And the pain of that moment was sharp, quiet, and deep. Yet beneath it all I sensed something else. She hadn't told me the worst part yet, and whatever her mother said next was the reason she walked into my room with that hardened look in her eyes. And I knew she was struggling to decide whether she should reveal it. She bent down to pick up the check, but her hand hovered over it for a long moment, as if touching it might betray whatever loyalty she was trying to hold on to. And when she finally lifted her eyes to mine, I saw the confusion swimming behind them, a mix of doubt and a longing for guidance that someone else had claimed before I even knew there was a battle happening. And I told her gently that I wanted to hear everything, not the polished version, not the lines her mother rehearsed with her, but the truth sitting heavy on her chest. And for a moment her face softened, the way it used to when she'd run to me after school with scraped knees and tangled hair. And she whispered that her mother said I only gave money because I couldn't give love, that I hid behind gifts so I didn't have to admit how much damage I'd done. And those words landed like stones inside me, not because they were true, but because they came from a daughter who had spent her whole life wrestling with shadows that didn't belong to her. And I kept my voice steady, calm, the mask I had worn my entire adulthood, telling her that love wasn't measured in money or silence or the number of times I swallowed my pain so my children wouldn't feel the weight of my past. But she shook her head slightly, saying her mother claimed I ruined the family long before they were born, that I manipulated my way into power in the company, that everything we owned was because I had pushed others aside. And hearing that made something old inside me stir, because the truth was far different, far heavier, rooted in a time her mother never cared to understand. And I watched my granddaughter bite her lip, eyes flicking toward the hallway again, as if someone had warned her not to repeat certain things. And I realized she was protecting more than just her mother's version of events. She was guarding a secret, something she had witnessed, something that didn't match the story she was told. And when I asked her gently what she wasn't saying, her shoulders tensed, and she murmured that there was one more thing her mother accused me of, something she didn't want to repeat. And the way her voice shook told me it was a sentence designed to break me completely. She stood completely still, her fingers curling around her own wrist the way children do when they're holding something too sharp inside. And I waited, not pushing, not rushing, just breathing in the quiet room that suddenly felt colder than the hallway behind her. And when she finally spoke, her voice was so soft I almost missed the words. Mom said, "You're the reason Grandpa died." And for a moment, everything in me stopped. The air, the heartbeat, the weight of the past I had spent decades trying to hold together without letting anyone see the cracks. And she looked at me with a fear that wasn't her own, a fear someone else planted, someone who knew exactly which wound would hurt the most. And I swallowed the storm rising in my chest, because rage would only prove their story. So instead, I sat down on the edge of the sofa, slow and steady, signaling that I wasn't shaken even though her sentence had sliced through years of silence I kept to protect people who no longer protected me. And I asked her calmly who told her that, even though I already knew the answer. But children need to hear themselves speak the truth before they can untangle the lies. And she hesitated, twisting the fabric of her sleeve, saying it started with her mother. But others repeated it, the whispers traveling during gatherings, during dinners, during those moments when people think children aren't listening. And she said she didn't understand it at first, but the story kept growing, shaping itself. And yesterday, she heard her parents talking late at night, her father asking why she felt the need to drag an old tragedy into conversations again, and her mother replying that Janet has carried that guilt long enough. She should face it. Words that were never meant for a child's ears, and certainly not meant to twist a granddaughter's heart. And I felt something shift inside me, not anger, not pain, but a quiet clarity. Because my husband's death was a chapter no one in this family understood, a chapter I had kept locked away to protect the ones who now blamed me for it. And I looked at my granddaughter, trembling, breaking under a story she didn't even believe fully. And I realized the time for silence was closing, that the truth I had buried to give my children a softer life was now being used as a weapon against me. And before I could gather my words to tell her even a small piece of the truth, she whispered another sentence, one that told me she already knew the accusations were wrong, but that she had seen something recently that made her question everything. She moved closer to the table, her small hand resting on its edge, as if she needed something solid to hold onto, and her eyes shifted toward the doorway again, checking that no one stood there. No shadow listening, no shape waiting to twist her words. And when she finally faced me, her voice carried a quiet tremble that didn't belong to memory. It belonged to something recent, something she couldn't explain without breaking a rule someone had set for her. And she said she didn't believe I caused her grandfather's death. Not truly, not in her heart, because she remembered how I talked about him, how my voice softened even when I thought no one heard me. But then she admitted she found something last week, something hidden in one of the storage boxes her mother kept in the guest room upstairs, a box she wasn't supposed to open. And the moment she said that, my breath tightened, because secrets in this family rarely stayed buried without a reason. And I asked her what she found, keeping my tone calm, the mask steady, the same mask I used the day I buried my husband, with half the city watching. And she said it wasn't one thing. It was a set of papers, old documents, notes, letters, and a photograph tucked inside a file with my husband's name on it. And she paused, studying my face, searching for any sign of guilt or fear. But all she would see was a woman holding decades of silence under her ribs, and she continued, saying the papers mentioned meetings, arguments, decisions her mother claimed I forced, and she didn't understand any of it, only that her mother called the documents proof. And that word struck me deeply, because the last time I saw those papers was the night I locked them away to stop a war inside this family, a war her mother had tried to start when she was much younger, angry, and desperate to blame someone for the life she refused to build herself. And I asked my granddaughter, gently, if she still had the papers, or if her mother took them back, and her eyes lowered as she whispered that her mother burned them in the backyard fire pit the same night, burned them quickly, before her father came home, muttering that Janet doesn't get to rewrite history. And hearing that sentence told me everything I needed to know about the storm rising behind my back. And just as I opened my mouth to explain the truth, my granddaughter looked up with fear sharp in her eyes and told me she hadn't revealed the most important thing yet, the thing she saw inside that box that made her question her mother's entire story. She took a slow breath, the kind a child shouldn't ever have to take, the kind that comes from carrying a truth too heavy for young shoulders, and she looked at the floor, as if the words she was about to release might change everything she believed about her own parents. And when she finally lifted her eyes again, they were filled with a quiet fear that made my heart tighten, because I recognized that expression. I had worn it myself at her age, standing in front of adults who expected me to protect their lies simply because I was small. And she said the papers weren't the most important thing in that box. The real shock was something tucked between two envelopes, something her mother hadn't meant for anyone to find. And she said it was a letter, handwritten, with her mother's name at the top and mine at the bottom. And she didn't understand the meaning of it at first, because the handwriting was messy, rushed, like someone wrote it in anger or fear. But she remembered one line clearly, a line that echoed in her mind all week. I can't keep pretending I'm the victim when I know exactly what I did. And when she repeated those words, my breath caught quietly in my chest, not because the line was surprising, but because I recognized the letter instantly. I wrote it decades ago, during a time when her mother had made accusations so cruel I thought they would tear the family apart. And I wrote that letter in the middle of the night, not to accuse her mother, but to stop myself from revealing secrets that would crush her future, secrets I chose to carry alone, because my children deserved safety, even from the truth. And I never meant for anyone to see that letter. I certainly never meant for a child to find it. And when I asked my granddaughter if she read anything else, she shook her head and said she didn't finish, because before she could, her mother walked in and froze, staring at her as if she had touched something forbidden, something dangerous. And then her mother grabbed the letter, the papers, everything in that box, and stormed outside to burn them, insisting none of this belongs in the past anymore. And she told her daughter that I was trying to twist her mind, that I had always done that. But my granddaughter's voice trembled as she whispered that something in her mother's face that night didn't look like anger. It looked like fear, real fear, the kind that comes from hiding something for too long. And I saw her hands shake as she tried to steady herself. And before I could comfort her, she told me there was one more detail from that night, something small but sharp enough to change the entire conversation. Because after her mother burned the papers, she made a phone call, and the person she called was someone I never expected to hear involved in this at all. She said the phone call happened after midnight, long after the flames in the backyard pit died down, long after she thought everyone was asleep, and my granddaughter only heard it because she went downstairs for water and froze when she saw her mother pacing near the sliding door, the orange glow from the last embers lighting her face in a way that made her look older, worn, almost hunted, and she whispered that her mother didn't sound angry anymore. She sounded desperate, and she kept repeating, "She's getting too close. She's asking questions. I told you this would happen if we didn't act sooner." And that single sentence made something cold curl around my spine, because her mother never admitted fear easily, never confessed she needed help, never let anyone hear her unravel. But my granddaughter said the most shocking part wasn't her tone, it was the name she said next. The person on the other end of the call, a name tied to a chapter of my life I had sealed off for years, someone who should have had no place in my granddaughter's world or in any conversation involving my husband's death. And she whispered that she heard her mother say, "I can't cover for you again, not this time." And then she stopped mid-sentence when she realized her daughter was standing at the bottom of the stairs, watching her, listening, seeing the side of her mother she tried so hard to hide. And instead of offering comfort or explanation, her mother shouted, asking what she had heard, what she thought she knew. And my granddaughter ran back upstairs with tears burning her face, hiding under her blanket, because she didn't want to believe that the story she'd been fed her whole life might be built on someone else's fear, someone else's mistake, someone else's guilt. And when she finished telling me this, she looked lost, like a child wandering in a dark room searching for something familiar to hold onto. And I reached out and placed my hand on hers, grounding her, steadying her voice so she could breathe again. And I asked her quietly, who was on the other end of that call? And she swallowed, eyes flicking toward the hallway, as if the name itself could summon trouble. And then she leaned closer to me and whispered the one name I never wanted dragged back into this family, the one name that meant the past hadn't stayed buried at all. When her lips formed that name, the room seemed to still around us, the quiet stretching long enough for my breath to thicken in my chest, because that name belonged to a man I had prayed I would never hear again inside these walls, my late husband's brother, a man who lived his entire life in the shadows of resentment, entitlement, and a bitterness so deep it poisoned every decision he made, a man who once stood beside me at the funeral with a hand on my shoulder while whispering that none of this would have happened if I had stayed in my place. And hearing his name now, coming from the mouth of my granddaughter, told me something terrible, something I had suspected years ago, but never had the proof to confront. And she said her mother spoke to him with a tone that wasn't respectful or familiar, but nervous, like someone reporting a mistake to the only person who knew the whole truth. And my granddaughter said she didn't understand why her mother would call him, of all people, a man who had barely visited our home, who stayed away from family gatherings, who acted like every smile cost him something. But I understood it too well, because decades ago, he tried to take something that didn't belong to him, control of the company my husband built. And when my husband refused, when he made it clear the shares were staying within our household, a rift grew so wide it never healed, a rift that turned into whispers, threats, attempts to manipulate my children. And I buried all of it the day my husband died, not because I wanted to protect his brother, but because my children were too young to carry the knowledge that someone in our own bloodline wanted to tear us apart. And now, Seeing my granddaughter trembling as she confessed the name, I realized someone had reopened that old wound and dragged her into it, and I asked her softly if she heard anything else, if she caught even a fragment of what they discussed. But she hesitated, chewing the inside of her cheek as her eyes dropped to the floor, and she said there was one more thing, something she didn't know how to interpret, something that made her stomach twist, because she had never heard her mother speak this way, and she whispered that before ending the call. Her mother said a sentence that didn't make sense to her, but felt wrong, heavy, dangerous. She said, "If she keeps digging, we'll both go down." And the moment those words left my granddaughter's mouth, a silence filled the room, because there was only one reason two people would fall together, and I knew, with chilling clarity, that whatever they hid was tied directly to the night my husband died. The words, "We'll both go down," hung between us like smoke, creeping into every corner of the room, till even the sunlight through the curtains felt dimmer, and my granddaughter watched me with wide, frightened eyes, as if expecting me to break, to crumble, to confirm her worst fear. But I didn't move, didn't flinch, because I have carried heavier truths than this across decades, without letting a single crack show on my surface. And I reached for her hand with steady fingers, grounding both of us, while inside me an old memory stirred, a memory I had locked away so deep I sometimes convinced myself it belonged to another lifetime. And she whispered that her mother's tone on that call didn't sound like someone protecting a lie out of pride. It sounded like someone trapped, someone tangled in something too large to escape. And she asked me if I knew what her mother could be hiding with him, why the two of them, who were never close, never even in the same room for more than a few stiff minutes, would be connected in something that felt dangerous. And I kept my voice, even as I told her I needed her to tell me everything she heard, every word she could remember, because sometimes the smallest detail unlocks the truth people work years to bury. And she nodded, hesitating before admitting she didn't want to say the next part, because it scared her, because it made her mother sound like someone she no longer recognized. But I encouraged her gently, letting her know she was safe here. And she said that after her mother whispered those last words, there was a pause, a long silence, and she thought the call had ended. But then she heard her mother say something faint, something trembling, as if the sentence itself hurt to speak. And she said her mother whispered, "I shouldn't have been there that night. I shouldn't have followed him." And the moment she said those words aloud, my pulse tightened in my wrist, because that single sentence pulled open a door I had kept locked for years, a door that led straight back to the night my husband didn't come home, the night everything in our family shifted forever. And my granddaughter looked at me, searching my face for understanding, for answers, for truth. But I couldn't speak yet, because my mind had already gone back to that night, back to the last phone call I received from my husband, the last message he left, the one clue no one ever connected to anything except me. I remember that night with a clarity that still tightens my breath, the way the sky looked heavy even before the storm rolled in, the way my husband's voice sounded steady on the phone, but carried a tension he tried to hide from me, tension I felt in the pauses more than the words. And I had asked him if he was on his way home, if he had eaten, if he was driving safely. Simple questions meant to anchor him, but he answered in short lines, distracted, as if something or someone was nearby. And the last thing he said before the line went silent was, "I need to handle something first." But don't worry, I'll explain everything soon. And those words haunted me for years because he never explained, never came home, never had the chance to tell me what he meant. And the police called me hours later while I still sat in the living room with the phone in my hand, the storm pounding against the windows. And I knew, before they said anything, that something had gone terribly wrong. But I didn't know why the story they gave me never aligned with the man I knew, never aligned with the routines he followed, never aligned with the path his car was found on. And for years, I carried the suspicion quietly, tucked behind my ribs like a bruise that never healed, because I sensed deeply that he hadn't been alone that night, that someone met him, someone confronted him, someone who caused the detour that took him away from me forever. And now, hearing my granddaughter repeat her mother's whispered words, I shouldn't have been there that night. Something inside me shifted, something old and buried, rising slowly to the surface. Because if she followed him, if she witnessed something, if she met someone he planned to confront, then everything I believed about that night was incomplete. And my granddaughter watched me, fear and confusion mixing in her eyes, as she asked if her mother had been involved in the argument her mother always claimed I caused, if she had a role in the story she spent years blaming me for. But I couldn't answer yet, because the truth forming in my mind was heavier than anything I had prepared her for. And before I could speak, before I could decide how much to reveal, we both heard the front door open downstairs, slow, controlled, familiar, and we realized we were no longer alone in the house. I kept my eyes on the quiet hallway as I walked toward the study, telling myself to stay calm, even though my chest felt tight, and the mask I always wear slipped right back into place the moment I heard soft footsteps behind me. It was my granddaughter's mother, Leela's mom, moving slowly like she wasn't sure if she should speak to me or pretend she didn't see me at all. And I could tell by the way she held her phone tight that she had already heard about the check being tossed aside like trash. She gave me a small smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind people use when they want something but don't want to look like they want it. And she said she hoped I wasn't taking anything too seriously, because kids these days don't understand value. Her voice was sweet, but there was a sharpness under it, the kind that comes from old grudges, money talk, and the same quiet jealousy I've felt from her side of the family for years. I listened without reacting, standing still while she went on about how teenagers just post things for fun, and how the check might have been better handled if it was in her hands. And I wondered if she even noticed she was giving herself away with every word she said. I told her calmly that the check was for my granddaughter, not for anyone else, and I saw her smile twitch for half a second before she covered it with a cough. She stepped closer then, lowering her voice like she was sharing something important, and she said maybe big gifts should be discussed with parents first so mistakes like this don't happen again. I kept my face gentle, even though my stomach tightened, because I could hear what she really meant. Money is power in this family, and she didn't like that the power was still in my hands. I told her I appreciated her thoughts and walked past her without giving her anything more. But when I reached the door of my study, I paused because I heard her whisper into her phone behind me, thinking I was out of range, telling someone that the old woman is slipping and it might be time to rethink the inheritance conversation. I stood there quietly, letting her words settle, and for the first time today, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, but clarity. and I knew exactly what I needed to do next. But before I could open the door, someone else spoke my name from the stairs, their voice shaking, and it made me turn around fast. And what I saw waiting for me, there made everything inside me go still. It was my granddaughter standing on the stairs, her hands gripping the railing like she wasn't sure if she should come down or run back to her room. And the moment our eyes met, I felt something loosen in me, even though I kept my face calm the way I always do when emotions start pulling at me. She looked smaller than she did earlier, like the weight of the whole day had settled on her shoulders, and she took one careful step forward, as if she needed to test the floor before trusting it. I waited without saying anything, wanting her to speak first, and after a long breath she told me she didn't know I was there when she made that video, that she didn't think I'd ever see it, and that she didn't mean to call my gift scrap in a way that would hurt me. Her voice wavered on the last words, a quiet crack she tried to hide by looking down, and for a moment I saw the little girl she used to be, the one who used to hold my hand tight in crowded places. She said her friends online always expected her to show off something big, that everything she posted had to look funny or dramatic, and that she didn't understand what a $1 million check really meant, because numbers that big don't feel real. I listened in silence, knowing her mother was standing behind the corner listening too, thinking she was being subtle, and I knew I had to choose my words carefully, because in this house, money turns small mistakes into family wars. I told my granddaughter that it wasn't the money that bothered me, that I've given away more than that without blinking, but it was the way she spoke about something meant to help her, something meant to carry her through life when I'm not here anymore. She looked up then, eyes shiny but held steady, and she asked me softly if I was angry with her. I shook my head, because anger wasn't what I felt at all. What I felt was something deeper, something like fear, the kind that comes when you start realizing the next generation might not be ready for the world you're trying to give them. I reached out my hand toward her, and she came down the rest of the stairs slowly, each step measured, until her fingers touched mine. And for the first time today, I felt a small relief soak through the noise around us. But before I could guide her into the study to talk alone, her mother stepped out suddenly with a sharp breath, pretending it was the perfect time to clear the air, and the look on her face told me she had no intention of letting this moment stay between just the two of us, and the way she positioned herself made it clear she was ready to fight for something I wasn't even sure she understood. Her mother stepped closer, the soft evening light catching the tension in her jaw, and I could see the way her eyes darted between me and my granddaughter, calculating, measuring, weighing every word, every movement, as if this room were a battlefield she had been preparing for years. She smiled politely, but it didn't reach her eyes, and I knew that smile. It belonged to a person who had mastered hiding truth under manners, under charm, under casual phrases that felt harmless, but carried hidden meaning. I kept my mask steady, voice calm, and said nothing at first, letting the silence fill the space, letting her realize that I wasn't rushing, that I had all the time in the world, that this confrontation would not catch me unprepared. My granddaughter squeezed my hand, small but determined, and I felt the weight of her presence grounding me. Then her mother said something that sent a chill down my spine. She spoke of lessons my granddaughter needed to learn about respect, about humility, about understanding her place, and each word was coded with a subtle accusation, an insinuation that I had somehow failed her child, that the check, my gift, was not a blessing, but a test I was imposing. I didn't flinch, didn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction, but inside, I counted the ways I had raised my granddaughter, ways I had carried her, taught her, protected her from the bitter words of adults who thought power came from money, from control, from manipulation. And I felt the injustice rise like heat, quiet, but sharp. I finally spoke, soft but deliberate, telling her that my granddaughter didn't need lessons from anyone but me, that she was old enough to see generosity and kindness in their pure form, and that if anyone had been guiding her understanding of money or respect, it should have been with truth, not whispers and fear. My granddaughter's eyes widened slightly, as if she realized for the first time that someone had been pulling strings behind her back, shaping her perspective to sow doubt where none belonged. Her mother's expression hardened, lips pressed tight, and she said that if she wanted, she could clear things up herself, stepping closer to my granddaughter as though to assert authority. But the moment she did, my granddaughter pulled her hand gently back toward me, steadying herself, and in that gesture, I saw a shift, the realization that loyalty, trust, and truth were stronger than manipulation. And just as I was about to speak again, a sudden knock at the door startled us all, and the timing, deliberate or not, made me realize we weren't done yet. Someone else had arrived, and I knew instinctively that their presence would change everything. The knock at the door echoed through the quiet house, sharp, deliberate, and I froze for a fraction of a second, feeling every nerve in my body tighten, as if warning me that this wasn't a casual visit. My granddaughter clutched my hand tighter, eyes wide, sensing the shift in the air before I even spoke, and I could see her mother tense, shoulders stiffening, the polite mask cracking slightly as she turned her head toward the door. I took a slow breath, walking toward it with steady steps, letting the sound of each footfall build the tension. And when I opened the door, I was met with someone I had not expected to see. Not for decades, not in this house, not in a situation like this. And the surprise tightened my chest in a way that I had not felt in years. It was my husband's longtime business partner, a man who once stood beside him during every major decision, someone who knew the intricacies of the company, the family, and the secrets we all tried to keep hidden. He didn't smile. He didn't try to soften the moment. His eyes, calm but heavy, scanned the room and settled on me, carrying a weight of urgency I could feel in my bones. He said nothing for a beat, and the silence pressed into the space between us like a tangible thing. And then he spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "Janet, we have a problem. Your granddaughter's mother isn't telling the whole story." The words landed like stones, and I felt the tension in the room double. My granddaughter's hand trembled in mine, and her mother's jaw tightened, but she still stood there, pretending to hold control. Even though the mask was slipping, I asked him calmly what he meant, and he stepped closer, glancing briefly at my granddaughter, then back at me, saying that he had seen documents, messages, things sent, hidden, and burned, and that they painted a version of the past that contradicted everything we believed, that the night my husband died had threads running through it that no one had noticed, threads connecting people I had trusted to truths I never expected to be questioned. I felt the old mask tighten around my face as I realized this moment wasn't just about the check or the letter or the accusations. It was about the legacy of everything my husband and I had built, and how fragile that legacy could be in the wrong hands. And before I could gather my thoughts, my granddaughter whispered in my ear, eyes wide. She had overheard another call, one that suggested even more people were involved than we had imagined. And the man at the door didn't move, just waited, the weight of what he knew pressing on all of us. And I realized then that nothing in our family had ever been as simple as it seemed, and the secrets were about to come alive again. The moment stretched like thick velvet, the three of us in the living room, the man at the door, my granddaughter clutching my hand, and her mother standing rigid, pretending calm, but failing. And I could feel the tension pressing against my chest in waves, the kind that makes your skin feel tight and your mind hyper-aware of every breath. The man spoke again, carefully, as if choosing each word with precision, and said that he had seen messages between her mother and my husband's brother, messages that were never meant to be read by anyone else, messages that revealed plans, disagreements, threats, small details that painted the night my husband died in a way I had never imagined. My granddaughter swallowed hard beside me, eyes wide, realizing that what she had overheard wasn't just family drama. It was part of a network, a story spun over years, carefully hidden. And suddenly the check, the letter, the burned papers, they all made sense in a new light. Her mother's mask cracked for the first time, just a flicker, her fingers trembling slightly as she crossed her arms, and I felt the old familiar tension rising inside me, the one I always feel when I realize someone underestimated my knowledge, underestimated my presence, underestimated my ability to see truth through the lies. But I kept my face calm, letting my granddaughter feel steady beside me. I asked the man at the door what he wanted from us, and he said it plainly. He needed our help to untangle the truth before the wrong people acted, before family secrets turned into permanent damage, before my granddaughter became collateral in something she should never have been part of. I felt my granddaughter lean into me slightly, and I whispered that we would figure it out together. But even as I said it, my mind raced. Her mother opened her mouth, trying to assert control, to spin the story her way. But the man held up a hand and said calmly, "It's too late for stories. The facts are out, and the next move is critical." I felt a sharp knot in my stomach, because I knew exactly what he meant. Someone had been planning, manipulating, and watching for years, and now we were in the middle of it, whether we wanted to be or not. My granddaughter's eyes darted to her mother, confusion and fear mixing in them, and she whispered softly, almost to herself, "What if they blame me?" I looked at her and held her gaze, whispering that she was not to blame, that this was never her fault. But I knew deep down that the next few hours could change everything we thought we knew about our family. And just as the man reached into his coat and pulled out a folder heavy with papers, he said, "There's more you need to see, and it starts tonight." The folder was thick, leather-bound, heavy in his hands, and when he placed it on the table, the subtle thud made the room feel suddenly smaller, heavier, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to watch what was about to happen. My granddaughter leaned closer, curiosity and fear warring in her eyes, and her mother stepped back slightly, as if the weight of what was inside that folder could burn her on contact. I kept my expression calm, but inside, every nerve was alive, recalling years of whispered conversations, subtle threats, and secrets I had buried carefully, knowing the moment might come when they resurfaced. He opened the folder slowly, revealing papers stacked with meticulous precision, documents, letters, photographs, notes, and I could see from the first glance that these weren't ordinary family papers. These were records, evidence, a map of truths and lies that had been hidden in plain sight for decades. And I realized immediately why my granddaughter's mother had panicked when she destroyed the last box. He pulled out a letter first, worn, yellowed at the edges, with handwriting I recognized instantly as my husband's own. The words weren't addressed to me, but to someone he trusted, someone who had promised to protect our family, to guard secrets, to ensure that the darkness of greed and manipulation never spread beyond the shadows. And reading those lines now, in the presence of my granddaughter and her mother, I felt the weight of betrayal, long-standing, systemic, the kind that wasn't just about money or pride, but about control, influence, and power over the people we loved most. My granddaughter's hand pressed into mine, and I felt her tremble slightly, sensing that this was bigger than any story she had known, bigger than any misunderstanding about a check or a letter, bigger than anything her mother had told her to shape her mind. Her mother tried to glance at the papers, eyes darting, lips tightening, as if she wanted to speak, to deny, to manipulate the narrative before it could fully land. But I held up a finger and whispered, soft but firm, "Let him speak, let the truth breathe." And he did, pulling out photographs that showed meetings, people we barely knew, people I had trusted once, conversations, signatures, and actions that linked decades of manipulation to that fateful night, the night my husband never came home, the night that had shaped everything in our family. My granddaughter's eyes widened as the connections became clear, and I realized that she had been living in the shadow of a story she barely understood. And as I leaned closer to read a note tucked between the photographs, my heart sank, because the handwriting told a story I had feared, a story that meant the past was not done with us, and someone else in that house was still watching, waiting to act before I could finish. A sound upstairs made us all freeze, the first indication that we weren't alone, and that the real confrontation had only just begun. The sound came first as a creak on the staircase, subtle but deliberate, and I felt it before I heard it. A presence moving slowly, calculating, aware that we were gathered around the folder, that the secrets inside were finally being exposed. My granddaughter flinched, squeezing my hand tightly, and I whispered for her to stay calm, though inside my chest hammered with the recognition that we were not alone in this house anymore. Her mother froze mid-step, eyes darting toward the stairs, lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. I stood taller, voice steady, mask perfectly in place, as I addressed the air. "Who's there?" The silence stretched for a heartbeat longer than it should have, and then a figure emerged, shadowed at first by the dim light, but unmistakable. My son-in-law, someone I had trusted, someone I had welcomed into the family, now stepping forward with a calculating look, a presence that carried both charm and danger. I could feel the tension snap in the room, the air thick with unspoken accusations, and I realized instantly that he had been listening, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to make himself relevant, to seize control of the story that had always belonged to me. He smiled, polite but sharp, and said, "I see we're catching up on family history," but there was a venom beneath it, a subtle threat that told me he had been privy to conversations, details, maybe even calls that he had no right to know. And yet, there he was, standing in my living room as if it were his stage. My granddaughter's eyes widened, her grip on my hand tightening, and her mother took a step back, her expression faltering as she realized he might be an ally or an enemy. And I knew I had to gauge this carefully, because every word in the next few minutes could tip the balance of power in ways I had long avoided, ways that could destroy or protect my granddaughter's future. I spoke calm, deliberate. "You shouldn't be here." But my tone was measured, leaving room for him to reveal what he knew, and his response was cold, precise. "I already know too much, Janet, and so do they." He gestured toward my granddaughter and her mother, and I realized with a sinking feeling that the web of secrecy, manipulation, and betrayal extended farther than I had ever imagined, touching every branch of the family, including the ones I tried hardest to protect. My granddaughter's voice trembled as she whispered, "Grandma, what do we do?" And I knew the moment we had prepared for had arrived. The confrontation, the revelation, the truth that could either heal or destroy everything we had built was about to unfold. And as he stepped closer, a document slipped from his coat, landing on the floor like a silent warning, revealing something no one in this room was ready to face. The paper hit the floor with a muted thud, sliding across the polished wood toward my feet, and I bent down slowly, keeping my hands steady, even though my pulse spiked with the knowledge that the contents of that sheet could change everything. My granddaughter leaned forward, eyes wide, caught between fear and curiosity, while her mother's face paled subtly, the confident mask slipping for the first time today, revealing the fear she had been hiding behind rehearsed politeness. I picked up the paper carefully, unfolding it, and my eyes immediately fell on a series of numbers, names, dates, and locations, details so precise, so deliberately compiled that I recognized immediately someone had been planning this exposure for years, waiting for the perfect moment, watching how each piece would fall into place. My breath caught as I realized these weren't ordinary documents. They were an evidence trail, a ledger of secrets, manipulations, and betrayals that implicated everyone who had tried to influence my family, including people I had once trusted implicitly. The names connected back to the night my husband died, each line a thread pulling at the fabric of our lives, linking phone calls, financial moves, burned documents, and whispered threats into a narrative I had feared to reconstruct. My granddaughter gasped quietly, clutching my hand, and I felt her tremble because she understood, even at her age, that what she had witnessed in our home, the conversations, the burned letters, the secret calls, was only part of a much larger web, a web in which she had unknowingly been tangled. And her mother's eyes flicked nervously between the paper and the man who had handed it to me, as if trying to gauge how much I had discovered, how much I already knew, how far the consequences might reach. I scanned the list, my mind moving rapidly, connecting events, calls, and actions over the years, seeing clearly now the precise way someone had manipulated her mother, tried to rewrite history, and even attempt to control the inheritance that I had worked so hard to protect. And a cold, sharp clarity settled in me. This was no longer just about money or misjudged words. This was about power, manipulation, and survival in a family that had learned to weaponize secrets for decades. My granddaughter whispered, almost too softly for anyone but me to hear, "Grandma, what if it's too late?" And I shook my head slowly, squeezing her hand, because I refused to let fear dictate the outcome. But inside, I knew the next few minutes would determine everything: the truth, the loyalties, the betrayals, and the path that would lead us through the storm waiting just beyond this room. And just as I folded the document carefully, placing it back into the folder, the sound of a car pulling up outside made all of us freeze, because someone new had arrived, someone who could either save or destroy, what little control we had left. The sound of tires crunching against the driveway pulled our attention instantly, sharp and deliberate, and I felt a jolt in my chest because I knew instinctively that this arrival was not coincidental. It was timed, orchestrated, meant to disrupt the fragile balance we had been struggling to maintain in the house. My granddaughter's hand tightened around mine, and I whispered for her to stay calm, to breathe, even though I could feel her fear radiating like electricity through her small frame. Her mother stepped toward the window, eyes narrowing, scanning the car, and I saw the flash of recognition, of calculation, cross her face before she quickly masked it, pretending she didn't know who it could be, pretending she wasn't involved somehow, though I had long suspected she had been communicating with outside forces. I remained seated, letting the moment stretch, letting the tension coil in the room like a living thing. And when the car door opened with a metallic click, my heart skipped, because stepping onto the driveway was a figure I had hoped never to see again. My husband's brother. His posture was calm, deliberate, hands in his pockets, expression neutral, but eyes sharp, watching, assessing, weighing, and I felt a cold shiver creep down my spine. I had spent decades carefully keeping his influence away from my family, shielding my children from the chaos he thrived on. But here he was, back in the house, back in our lives, and it was clear that nothing would remain the same after this night. My granddaughter gasped softly, pressing closer to me, whispering, "He's really here," and I squeezed her hand, signaling both reassurance and readiness, because I knew that the confrontation we had been building toward, layer by layer, secret by secret, was finally unavoidable. Her mother's eyes flicked to him, narrowing, and she muttered something under her breath, almost inaudible. A warning or a plea I couldn't quite hear. And I understood immediately. Alliances were being tested, loyalties measured, and deception would be revealed in the coming moments. I rose slowly, keeping my voice calm, even as the energy in the room thickened, and said, "We need to talk, all of us." My husband's brother tilted his head slightly, a quiet acknowledgement, and the air felt heavier, charged with years of unspoken tension, unhealed wounds, and secrets that had festered far too long. My granddaughter looked at me with wide eyes, breath held, sensing the gravity of the moment, and I knew I had to prepare her for the truth while protecting her from the shock that could unravel everything. And just as the front door clicked closed behind us, sealing the circle, I realized that the confrontation, the revelations, and the decisions that would decide our family's fate were about to begin. And I knew, with a sinking certainty, that tonight nothing would ever be the same. The room felt impossibly small as all of us stood together. The man who had once been my husband's closest ally, my granddaughter trembling at my side, her mother rigid yet exposed, and my husband's brother calm, dangerous, yet undeniably human. And in that moment, I realized that every fear, every secret, every manipulation had brought us here, to a confrontation long overdue, where truths could no longer be hidden and the past could no longer dictate the future. I took a deep breath, letting the weight of decades settle into my chest, and spoke slowly, deliberately, my voice carrying the calm but firm authority I had cultivated over a lifetime, telling everyone that we had choices, that we could let old resentments destroy the family, or we could confront the pain, the lies, the mistakes, and rebuild on honesty, respect, and care for the next generation. My granddaughter, holding my hand tightly, looked up at me with a mixture of fear and trust, and I reassured her that she had done nothing wrong, that the misjudgments, the whispers, the manipulations were never hers to carry, and that the gift I had given her, her inheritance, her future, was never about money, but about knowing she belonged, knowing she was protected, knowing she had love and guidance to navigate a world that could be cruel. I turned to her mother, seeing the mask finally drop, the realization that deception had only caused pain, that trying to control outcomes had left her vulnerable, and I offered a hand, not just in reconciliation, but in a promise that the family could move forward if honesty was embraced. My husband's brother, surprisingly, softened slightly, acknowledging his own mistakes, his past greed and resentments, and I felt the room shift subtly, the tension loosening, not fully gone, but enough that healing seemed possible for the first time in years. We spent the night going through the folder, sorting through documents, confronting truths, explaining choices, and as the hours passed, my granddaughter began to smile faintly, the tension in her shoulders melting, the fear in her eyes replaced with cautious understanding, and I knew that despite the chaos, despite the betrayal, despite the manipulation, she would emerge stronger, wiser, more aware of her family and herself. By the time the first light of morning filtered through the curtains, the room felt lighter, a new rhythm settling over us, and I whispered softly to my granddaughter that the world would always have challenges, but we would face them together. I looked around at everyone, feeling both exhaustion and relief, and said gently, like, share, subscribe, thank you, goodbye. And as we sat quietly, the weight of the night fading into understanding, I realized that even in the darkest moments, love, truth, and resilience could guide a family back to each other, stronger than before.